Hello and welcome to Big Deal. I'm Nisha Poddar. Now on Big Deal today, we will delve deeper into the regulations surrounding social media in the light of the recent amendments in the IT rules by the government, especially, remember, at a time when Elon Musk takes over Twitter and pushes the pedal on free speech on the platform. So where do we really stand amidst all these big changes, and is the beginning of a new era for the social media platforms and concept of free speech really beginning? So let's find out from our panel of experts. Joining me are today Siddharth Pai, Tejasvi, as well as Ajay Roti. All of them, welcome to CNBC-TV18. Ajay, my first question to you regarding the amendments, which have really triggered a huge amount of debate. What is the big change in your view?
So, Nisha, there are three key changes which have been proposed. And the first one relates to the obligations cast on the social media intermediaries, which includes Twitter, Instagram, and all of these companies. Earlier, they were just required to inform their users of the kind of content that should not be posted, which included, racially sensitive information, misleading information, etc. Now the change requires them to be they have an obligation to ensure that the users don't put it up. That's the first key change. Second is they've rationalized what are those set of things that should not be put up. They've included material which could incite violence between communities. They also require the social media intermediaries to ensure that the rights given under the Constitution are protected, and in particular, equality, freedom of speech, and personal liberty. And the last change is really the most significant, which is the introduction of the concept of a appellate committee. Earlier, if anybody had issues with any of the posts, you would go to the grievance officer appointed by the intermediary. Today, if you're not happy with the grievance officer or the redressal from there, there's an option to appeal to the appellate committee. And that's a committee of 3 people nominated by the government. So these are the 3 key changes.
All right. So those are the changes and which have caused a lot of debate. So Tejasvi, jump in on this one. What is your view on the amendments that are made? And what do you think legally is tenable when it comes to the private companies, the intermediaries, which are essentially private companies, having more accountability on the content that is given by the consumers on their platforms?
So, Nisha, at the very beginning, I'd just like to say this, that we are not disputing the fact that the internet needs some form of regulation. That is well acknowledged. However, what the IT rules does is it imposes new duties and responsibilities on intermediaries that seek to enjoy the legal immunities that is offered by the IT Act, particularly under Section 79. Now, these duties included creation of a grievance redressal officer or, enabling traceability requirements, etc. What happens if these intermediaries don't abide by these responsibilities? They lose their immunities offered under Section 79. That makes them legally liable for the acts of third party on their platform. Now, whether this sustains legal scrutiny is something to be pondered over, because legislative history of Section 79 is very clear on the fact that the government cannot just take away legal immunity and make it conditional. That too for third party content. However, that is exactly what the IT rules does, and the recent amendments to the IT rules takes it a step further. It says that if a user essentially complains against a content it believes to be, say, misinformation, and if the platform doesn't resolve this complaint within 72 hours, the matter may be taken up by court, and it may decide if the platform should lose its legal immunity based on its action or inaction. Now, this is in violation of a landmark Supreme Court judgment, that was the Shreya Singhal judgment, where it held that intermediaries cannot decide permissibility of any content without an order of a court or an order by the government.
Yes.
So this model is internationally recognized. So it essentially makes private platforms arbiters of permissible speech on the internet.
All right. So there are 2 aspects, Tejasvi, that you have highlighted. One, the legality of it, and as well as the risk. And on the other hand, also the control and power that these private companies can have. Let me focus on the regulatory risk aspect, so that by the startup world, the tech world, and the investors in that. How do you see this new age of more regulations, stricter regulations, and these amendments coming in? Is there a huge regulatory risk being built in for the investors?
The first and foremost fact is, I think all entrepreneurs and investors need to acknowledge the fact that the era of unregulated tech is actually over. For the past 20 years, the tech sector has actually seen the lowest level of regulation compared to any of the comparables they may end up seeing. If you actually look at pharma, you actually look at news, you actually look at print media, any other forms as part of that itself. So I think what we've seen over the past 20 years, governments have come to acknowledge the outsized role that technology and these large giants actually play in terms of the everyday lives of their citizens. And they've actually moved to actually start regulating all these to a much larger extent itself. Now, we foresee the kind of this sort of regulatory risk will actually play into the valuation multiples that these companies actually end up enjoying as well. And what we'll end up seeing is, rather than the unregulated premium these companies actually enjoyed, the degree of adherence to regulation will actually end up commanding the premium that some of these companies will actually end up facing in the market itself. For any investor who actually looked at, any investor or entrepreneur who looked at the arbitrage, the regulatory arbitrage that existed previously, will have to go back to a drawing board and actually rework the entire paradigm of investing into these kind of companies itself.
Right, so the valuation dynamics and a big change is coming in how these companies are, seen in terms of investments as well as the matrices as well. But Siddharth, I want to ask you about one important aspect that Tejasvi had raised about the third-party risk that comes on these intermediaries, which are heavily invested through the startup community, through the VC community. So as an investor, how do you see the risk proportion that is coming in this business?
I think there's an immense amount of risk that's actually inherent in the business model right now of being an intermediary. We've actually seen this play out when it comes to e-commerce companies as well, where the owners of any fake goods, etc., was actually placed upon the intermediary itself. I think this is part of a paradigm shift in terms of the government to rather than try to regulate the entire arena that exists, instead actually regulate the marketplaces that actually operate in these areas itself. So create the rules of the playground, give over monitoring of the particular rules to these organizations itself, and then actually end up monitoring them.
Ajay, you want to take that particular point forward, and how do you view all the risks involved for the intermediaries and the accountability as well as the responsibility which has increased?
Yeah, so I think with this change, one significant additional obligation that's on the intermediaries is really, it's the onus is on them now, because the rules require them to have put reasonable efforts to restrict the user from uploading any of these restricted information, if I can use that phrase. Because earlier they only had to inform the users that you can't upload all these kind of data or pictures or post messages which infringe on any of these things. But right today, as per the new rules, they are required to have reasonable efforts to stop a user. Therefore, the onus clearly shifts on to the intermediary. Now, what is reasonable effort? That's something that will have to be tested, because what amounts to a reasonable effort? And it also means that today the right to censor moves actually to the intermediary. And if they do not perform that role properly, like Tejasvi said, they run the risk of a higher exposure to liabilities for the data that's on their platform.
Right. So you raise the point of risk that is coming in. But Ajay Roti, also there is a control aspect which is coming in for a private company. What do you have to say about the subjectivity? Because there are grey areas in terms of the definition of what their responsibility as well as accountability means on the content on their platform. So is there a lot of scope for subjectivity as well as power play in that, which can be at the expense of fundamental rights as well as free speech?
Yes, Nisha, that's a very good point, because there is a lot of subjectivity there. One of the changes that they have done in the current amendment is to drop material relating to defamation out of the restricted list, because there the government believes that whether something amounts to defamation or not actually is subject of judicial review and cannot be decided by the platform. But at the same time, they've introduced a clause restricting, or rather requiring, the intermediaries to respect all the rights accorded to the citizens under the Constitution. Now, this is a very wide phrase. Now, what does respecting the rights accorded under the Constitution mean? Therefore, yes, you are absolutely right. Each intermediary will have to exercise its own judgment to decide where that line has to be drawn and what does that mean. Now, how will that be read by the courts? How will it be implemented by the government is something that we have to see. But there is quite a bit of subjectivity that will be there in implementation and interpretation of these rules.
All right. So one is from the side of the intermediaries, which are more accountable. And on the other is the powers that now are vested with the government because of the government-run body, which has been now proposed, which is the GSC. Siddharth, what do you have to say about this? And do you think that it will open scope for more government's oversight, requirement for control? And on the other hand, do you also think that these big companies which run the social media platform, the global giants, versus the government who are actually at loggerheads, their friction is going to accentuate much more?
We've actually seen this along the lines of the recent CCI ruling when it comes to Google. We've seen record fines actually being placed against Google, against Apple, against Facebook, a number of them across the entire world itself, and especially social media, which has placed an outsized role in elections across the entire world. Most of the governments are looking to create the same kind of safeguards that they have over here as what they would have for print media and any of these other places. Now, the interplay amongst the rights of the citizens, the rights of a private corporation to actually to actually create its own rules and regulations, as well as the government to actually ensure protection of the citizens, as well as to ensure public peace is something that's going to become very, very important. I think one of the roles that the government's put up over here, especially to the creation of the self-regulatory organization, is to give up as much of this particular self-regulation onto the participants and these larger tech players itself. So I think the SROs are going to play an outsized role when it comes to these particular matters. And from the grievance appellate committee, I think an important point to take away is in case anyone's actually aggrieved by one of the issues that have actually been taken up by one of these grievance officers or by one of the changes made by these committees, they now have the ability to actually end up escalating that and actually seeking some sort of redressal. Previously, they would have to go to the courts, and courts more often than not have said it's a private enterprise. They can choose to serve certain people and not choose to serve other people itself. So I think this has been a positive light for citizens to ensure they have a means of escalation. But how is it going to affect the social media intermediaries? It's something we can only see once all this actually goes into action and the first few cases actually end up coming to this particular GSC itself.
All right. So GSC is an important aspect to look at. It's the new animal that now we are going to deal with. In fact, we'll focus more on that as well as the free speech aspect. And we'll come back and discuss all those aspects with our team of panelists. Stay tuned to Big Deal.